In this training session, we're going to look at the EventSentry Syslog daemon that's part of the EventSentry network services. I'm going to show you how to configure the network services to enable Syslog, and we're also going to take a look at some sample data that we are receiving from a remote Syslog device. So in the management console, if you just navigate to network services, you can see the overall status of the component. You can restart it, configure the logging, and you can also see the status of each subcomponent in here, including Syslog, of course. And we can, of course, configure the Syslog daemon by clicking on Syslog daemon. We can see that it's listening on UDP, TCP, as well as TLS, with a minimum TLS requirement version here. And you can also limit how many Syslog messages are being accepted by the daemon. In most cases, that's not necessary, but if there's some concern that some devices may be sending too much, you can throttle the incoming messages here, 50,000 per 24 hours in this case. And you can also restrict which networks or IP addresses are allowed to send Syslog messages. Of course, you can also limit that through the firewall. It's important that with all of these components, SNMP, Syslog, NetFlow, that you make sure that the Windows firewall is not blocking these incoming packets. EventSentry does create a rule to allow traffic to come in, but it's always a good idea to double check that if something is not working as expected. So when a Syslog message comes in, EventSentry can do two things with them. You can either write them to the database and or write them to the Windows event log. And you'll notice this pattern on a lot of the dialogues that we have in EventSentry, a database and an event log dialog. We only have one database configured here in this EventSentry installation, and that's the one that's listed here by default. Now let's take a look at the settings. Again, this is also a common dialog that you're going to see in other areas of EventSentry. So by default, the database feature here is configured to write everything that's being received to the database. We don't have any exceptions configured. So with this setting here, everything gets written to the database unless it's excluded below. You could switch this around, in which case everything is excluded by default unless it is listed down here. And you'll notice how the text here changes from exclusions to inclusions. So I'm going to explain this on an example. So we're going to go into the web reports, and I already have the Syslog search open here. You can find the Syslog search under features, logs, and Syslog. And we can see two devices writing to the database, and we can click on detailed and we can see some of the messages here. You'll see and you'll notice, no doubt, that we have a lot of data coming from a firewall. There's some stuff sprinkled in between here by the Linux machine, but most of the messages are coming from the firewall, mostly about packets being matched or blocked. And let's just say we wanted to say, you know what, we're not interested in anything that's pertains to these firewall rules. We could take a sample text out of here. Let's just say this much here, copy it, and add it here as an exclusion. Make sure you always add the asterisks because we're not matching the entire text, we're just matching this subpart here. So with this setting here, what we're saying is let's write everything to the database that comes in via Syslog except any text that matches this here. And if we were to flip this around, then we would be the opposite. We would only be writing the firewall rules. So let's move on to the event log tab. Event logging is disabled by default, and the only purpose for event logging would be to generate email alerts because we already have all the information that we need in the database and it's searchable, so there's really no reason to have them in the event log. However, event log is useful if you want to dispatch email or any other type of alert from a Syslog packet. So you check this box to enable this functionality here. And you'll notice the same type of settings here that we have on the database, meaning that by default, all incoming Syslog messages are written to the event log unless they're excluded here below. Syslog and Windows have different event severities. In Windows, we have information warning and error for non-security events, whereas in the Syslog protocol, we have anything from debug, info, notice, all the way up to emergency. I've configured this so that anything up to warning is ignored. Errors and critical are translated to warnings, and the rest is translated to errors. But of course, you can customize that. So how does this work? So now that this is enabled and we are including everything except for this here below, we can take a look at the application event log and look at some of the events here. So which ones are syslog? Well, if we go back here and look at the bottom, it says here all incoming syslog messages are logged to the application event log with event ID 500. So anything that's going to be at least an error is going to be logged to the application event log with event ID 500. So we can filter here. I already have 500 from an earlier test. And here we can see a number of event messages from the syslog category. So if we double click that, we can see some of these messages. They're all the same. Most of them talking about the key exchange and connection closed by remote host. So if we go back to the syslog daemon here and double click this, you can see that I excluded this from the event log. So future messages will not be written to the event log if they contain that text. I'm going to go over the actual rules and how to dispatch alerts from the event log from Syslog in a separate video. So how do we get Syslog messages to EventSentry? That depends on the device. For full-blown OS systems like Linux, BSD, Mac, and so forth, you'll usually be editing a text file, rsyslogd.conf and so forth, where you essentially configure the syslog daemon to send either all or some messages to EventSentry. And we have a number of KB articles on our website with more information, or you can just do a search on the internet for that. There's lots of resources about this out there. And if you are trying to get a network device to send syslog messages, such as a firewall, a switch, printer, and so forth, then usually you'll configure that in the web interface of that device. And there's different terminology being used. Sometimes it's referred to as a log server, sometimes referred to as a syslog server, and so forth. But it's usually pretty straightforward, and generally speaking, you will just enter an IP address or host name of the remote syslog server you want to send the logs to. And sometimes you have the ability to also specify a different port or enable TLS. And that's how easy it is to set up Syslog. And like I mentioned, the Syslog's data is available here in the web reports under Features, Syslog. And all the configuration is done in the Management Console.